Hey guys, my name is Javier Perez, and I'm currently a senior material artist at PlayStation's Visual Arts Service Group. I've been in the industry for about 9 years now. In this lesson, we'll be going over how to create a mossy cliff wall inside of Substance Designer. We'll be covering techniques, thought processes, and general understanding of how the material was made. So let's get started. So to begin, I'm just going to start up and create a new substance graph. Just going to name it Cliff Tutorial. And the first thing I like to do with every material I make is just go ahead and bring in a base material node. That way we can create the outputs from that guy. You can go ahead and actually choose a template when you first create your substance graph, but I like to use this method. Just for me, it gives me a little bit more control on what nodes it creates, and also just gives me a little kind of more control on how to set this whole graph up from the beginning. So I like putting some base colors in there and some values on my normal and my ambient occlusion and height. And then I'm going to go into my material and make sure that DirectX is off. And then I'm just going to start with a uniform color, plug all that stuff in. So to begin, I'm actually going to create the initial block shape that's going to be for our cliff. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm just using a polygon and I'm blending that between a gradient linear. What this does is give us a nice kind of interesting shape to start out with, almost like a slanted rock almost. We don't want to use something that's, kind of uniform, so this gives us a little bit, just breaks up the silhouette of that shape a little bit. Next up, I want to start adding some cuts in here. And to do that, I just go ahead and bring in a cells, scale it to 4, and then just blend it on a multiply. Continuing on, I'm going to add another gradient to give the initial block shape a little bit more variation. This just helps break up the just the angles that are actually being cut into the rock shape. I want to make this, when I'm going through all these steps, I basically want to make this rock shape as kind of just have a lot of variety in it, because we're going to be duplicating it like later on in the graph. I just want to have a bunch of certain aspects to this block. So next up, I'm just breaking up the edges with the crystals and a multi-directional warp grayscale, setting it to a min and setting it to like around 60, and it gives us this kind of result. So now we're getting really crazy with just like the variation inside the block itself. We got a bunch of different cracks in there. I bring in a levels to bring up the whites a little bit, because we're losing them just slightly, and that's just for later on when we start adding more things. Next up, I bring in a cube 3D and I mess with the orientation and scale. You guys feel free to mess with this one right here. This one just it's up to you guys what you guys want to do here. And then I'm just going to blend it again. And this, again, it gives us just a little bit more control on the angle variation. It's similar to what we were doing with the gradient, but because it's a cube 3D, we're just getting a little bit more variation in there. Next up, I want to add some slashes on this guy. So I'm going to do the same thing with the crystals, but I'm going to actually use a transform to almost squash them down and stretch them a little bit, so they almost look like slashes. They're going like in a directional pattern almost. So here you can see me kind of messing with that. And then I'm just going to plug that into the slope blur grayscale and just bring down the intensity slightly. So now we have some directionality to those scratches a little bit. You can kind of see in the 3D viewport what we're getting there. Next up, I'm going to do a subtle warp here, and this is just to warp the edges just slightly. Sometimes these values I'm putting in, I'm referencing off a finished graph, but just so you guys know the values I'm plugging in here. You guys can mess with whatever values you guys want, but that's just to break up the edges even more so. Next up, I want to add a little bit more directional noise. It's kind of similar to what we were doing with the slashes, but we're just going to do it a little bit more subtler, and then we're just going to blend it into itself. So here I just took a directional blur on those crystals, and then do a transform to rotate them, then a blur, and then the levels. And I'm trying to get those whites and blacks to really shine through, so I'm getting those like peaks on there. Then I'm just going to blend that onto a min. And with that, I'm just going to blend it into itself here. That way we have a little bit more control on how much it's blending onto the main shape that we have here. So we're almost ready for the fun part. Here I want to have a couple variations, mostly two here, so I just rotated one 180. That way it looks like we have two different variations of the rocks, but we literally just rotated one 180. That way when we actually plug it into the splatter circular, it actually is reading two different shapes rather than just one, so we kind of break up that repetition a little bit. And here, this is where the fun kind of begins. This is where you guys can kind of start messing with these different values and see what kind of results you get. The main ones I would say to play with are the position random, the scale. Once we start bringing up the scale, you can kind of see it starts filling in the whole node a little bit. And then start messing with the luminance random. That way it breaks up the kind of how much these rocks are laying on top of each other. And also the pattern rotation pivot is a good one to play with as well. So here we're starting to get some interesting shapes. It's almost looking like a cliffside now. So I'm just going through each different parameter and just kind of playing and tweaking to my liking until I find something that I think looks cool. So already there, once we plug that guy in, we can kind of start seeing that we have these shapes and this nice cliff blocky shape coming through. Again, as I'm going through the graph, I'm naming everything and framing it. That way it's just easier as we continue going down the line in our graph. So now that we have these main shapes, I'm going to do some similarities that we did with the original block shape. And here I'm again just using a multi-directional warp with a Perlin noise, and I'm just going to break up the edges. And then I brought in a levels to bring in like some of the blacks and the whites, because we're losing some of those a little bit off all the different things we were doing throughout the graph. So this just brings us back into our correct ranges. I'm going to do more edge breakup here. Another directional warp, but this time instead of using a Perlin noise, I'm actually using a moisture noise. So feel free to use different noises. You guys can kind of see the different results it gets for you guys. So next up, I want to break up the actual surface of the cliffside. So I'm just going to bring in a cells 1, and then I'm going to bring in a clouds 2, and I'm going to slope blur these two together. But you'll notice that on the clouds 2, I actually took that down to a 256 by 256. I like doing this with some of the noises, because when you start blending these guys in, you'll get almost like larger shapes with your noises by putting it down to a lower resolution. So play around with that. Here I actually plug in one that's 2048 just so you can kind of see the similarities between the two. We're going to plug that guy into a directional warp from our original graph height. And then we're going to invert that, and then we're going to blend it into itself. So here I'm just setting it to a low opacity, 0.23, and just setting it to add. And once we plug this guy in, you can kind of see now we're getting some nice crevices, some nice kind of indentations, and just some overall nice surface breakup on the actual cliff. So here I'm bringing in a shadows, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to invert this, and then I'm going to blend it into itself with a subtract. What this is going to do is that it's going to actually it's going to exaggerate the valleys. So any dark spots you see on the cliff are just going to get a little bit more deep, and they're going to be more exaggerated. So I just wanted those kind of valleys to be a little bit more exaggerated. Next up, I'm going to use the scratch generator, which is a great node in Substance. And again, this is like one of those nodes that you guys can kind of play with. There's so many parameters that you guys can mess with. So you can either copy the ones I'm plugging in or play with them, whatever you want. But to this guy, I'm just going to use a bevel. And then I'm going to blend a Perlin noise on top of it just to break up so it's not completely repeating over the entire texture. And then once that's there, I'm actually going to blend it into our main cliff. So what this will do is it'll give us some nice scratches in our surface. I just wanted to feel like there was some sort of carvings into those guys. So that's how I got that result. Again, here you see me doing a subtract here, and you kind of see before and after what's going on there. Something subtle, but it's there. A lot of these kind of subtle tweaks, you won't really see it till you kind of zoom into the material. So, and here I actually went to the material properties, and I'm just messing with the height and just seeing at different tessellation levels how it's working here. Next up, another kind of small detail here. I'm taking a dirt, doing a levels to it, and then a slight bevel. And this just gives me some small little pockets or, you know, little crevices that you can kind of see. So you go before and after. Nothing too crazy, but again, every little detail counts, especially when these are going to be used for the normal and the color later on. Next up, this is going to be the last kind of surface noise that I use as we start going into our moss layers. So here, this is where I just add the final surface noise. It's just an overall noise. You guys can feel free to use whichever one in Substance. I know there's a bunch, but personally I love using moisture noise. I feel like it gives me a bunch of control, and there's a lot of cool settings you can tweak on that guy. Cool. So this is where we're actually going to start our lichen and kind of bring in some of that nice fuzziness to the material. Since it's all very hard surface with the rocks, we're actually going to start bringing in the moss and the lichen on here. So to start off, I like bringing in a Grunge Map 04. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the settings on this tile generator to just give us a nice variation and a nice kind of repeating pattern. And it breaks up just the main overall larger shape. So the Grunge Map 04 is cool on its own, but I just want to repeat it a little bit and give us some nice organic feel to it. So feel free to, again, these are just nodes that you can, honestly, you can just mess with for hours and kind of tweak to your liking until you get something that looks pretty cool. So either feel free to just use the values that I input here or do whatever you like. Well, once that's all set, I add a blur high quality grayscale just so that those edges aren't as sharp. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to subtract with another grunge just to break that up a little bit more. It was just a little bit too much for the mask, so I wanted to break it up with another grunge map. Now, what I'm doing here is that new mask that we created, I'm actually plugging that into the opacity slot of a blend that I'm blending our original cliff with a blurred version of itself. So what I like to do when I'm layering stuff on top of materials is I like to actually add a pre-blur. Now what this pre-blur does is that it blurs the underlying area where the stuff is going to be added onto, and it kind of conforms to the shape of the cliff. So if you have these ridges, like anything you add onto it, it's just going to conform to that shape rather than just completely laying on top of it. So that's what you saw me doing there. Once I had that pre-blur, I just added another blend and just added that original mask on top of itself. Moving forward, I'm actually going to lower the levels on this guy because I know I'm going to add some more features, mainly the moss. And I just want to have enough grayscale values that when we add the moss, like if we add like a white value or something, that it's not clipping out at all. So that's why I just lowered the value to get closer to a grayscale. To begin the moss, I'm actually going to create a placement mask. And what I'm doing here is I'm just using the dust node. And to get the dust node to work, we're just going to plug in an ambient occlusion and a normal from our cliff material. And this dust node is a great node to use to create like any sort of mask. So I use it a lot in conjunction with the dirt node later on. But this is just a nice way to get any sort of black and white mask. So I go ahead and invert that. I do a levels to get the blacks and the whites. And then I just do another grunge and then, I add a grunge because I want to break it up again, kind of like what we did with the lichen mask as well. So moving forward, this is where we're actually going to create almost like a separate graph and kind of combination here. So we're going to leave that mask that we just created with the moss placement and just leave it alone for now because we're focusing on creating the actual leaves for our moss. So basically all I did here was take a disc shape, I squashed it on the X, and then I used one of my new favorite nodes, the trapezoid node, to just stretch the bottom inwards. I then added a gradient to give it some sort of depth to the plain leaf, and then I did a directional warp with a purlin just to give it some wobble to it so it's not completely straight up and down. From there, I'm going to plug in this new leaf shape into a tile sampler. Now, before I start using this tile sampler and messing with all these different settings, I'm actually going to create a few inputs that are going to help us in some of the actual parameters that we're going to mess with in the tile sampler. So here, I'm actually just doing a invert on the scale of this thorn shape that we created. I made an invert grayscale. I made a transform. The transform isn't really doing anything. Or sorry, I didn't make a transform. I made just a dot node just so that we can keep clean on our graphs to see all the connection points. I made a normal. And then what I did was I did a blend with a black uniform color just to get a half just a half circle shape going on there. And that's going to be plugged into our mask input. So now that we have all those guys plugged in, this is where I start messing with the different parameters here. A lot of these kind of inputs that we plugged in, we're actually going to set the values to 1 here. So like if you see me messing with a vector map or a mass map threshold, anytime you see any sort of multiplier or threshold, it's mostly calling out to those inputs that we plugged in. So make sure to use those to your advantage. Now, I'm actually sampling off screen the completed graph, so a lot of these numbers I'm kind of working from top to bottom, but when I was actually creating this, it was just more so messing with these different values to see what kind of results we get. And once I have kind of a clump that I like, I basically take that tile sampler and duplicate it and then start messing with some of the parameters again just to get some sort of different variation, because I want to have 2 different clumps of the moss and to break up that surface, or sorry, to break up the repetition of the actual moss shape. So instead of having 1 moss clump, we have 2, and that kind of gives us a little bit more variety on the moss. So once we have those 2 moss clumps, I'm actually going to bring another tile sampler, and this is where our moss placement mask that we created earlier comes into play. So that mask is going to get plugged into our mass map input, and what that'll do is it's telling this tile sampler only create the moss in this area from that mask that we created. So here I'm just plugging in some parameters and rotating stuff as I go along. And this is just giving us the variation. Again, just playing with the different parameters, seeing what we get here. And then once I start bringing up the mask map threshold, you can kind of see that it's the influence of the mask is starting to come in. So as I bring it up closer to 1, it's almost 1-to-1 to that mask that we created from the moss earlier. You can kind of lower it a little bit if you want more of the moss showing, but that's just where I felt looked cool. So moving forward, the moss is looking cool at this point. I wanted to add some sort of undulation on it just to give it, like, you know, when you're looking at the moss, I just don't want it to look completely flat on the surface. I want it to have some kind of raised heights and different height variations. So what I'm doing here is I'm just doing a black and white spots, a high pass grayscale, a histogram scan, and slope blurring that. It's a bunch of different slope blurs and blur high quality grayscales, and I'm just blending in between those to give some sort of undulation shapes to it. So it gives us these nice almost circular kind of repeated pattern that you can kind of see here once I start blending these guys in. It gives us some kind of interesting shape, but mostly what we're not really concerned about the way it looks. It's just mostly giving us some interesting noise that's going to be overlaid on top of our moss that we just created. So here I'm actually plugging in the moss that we created and then blending that with our newly created undulation. And I'm using that same mask. That way the undulation is only, it's only being affected to the moss that we just created. So once we have all that in place, I'm actually going to bring in a histogram scan, and I'm going to levels out that new moss that we just created. And this is going to be used as a mask for anything moving forward. So anytime we want to call out the moss again, we're just going to go to this specific mask node that we have here. So kind of like what we did with our lichen, I'm going to do the exact same kind of setup here, where we're going to do a pre-blur, and you see right there where I added the mask and then I did a blur on top of itself, you'll notice that it's getting this kind of almost smooth transition on the actual cliff. And this is good because now that we have these kind of flat, smooth transitions, we can actually take our original moss and blend it on top of each other, and we'll have a nice transition. We won't have any sort of clipping, and it's just going to give us a nice kind of, yeah, you can kind of see how it's laying on that cliff. It's nice and even, and it's kind of conforming to the shape of the cliff, and that's because of that pre-blur that we're doing there. So just continuing to move forward, making sure everything is looking good. Next up, I want to add some finer moss. So we have these kind of, you can individually see these strands in the moss. I want to have just some more kind of noisy, just break almost another variation of the moss, but this one, it's not necessarily, you won't be able to see the finer details, so you won't be able to see the actual like the leaves in it and stuff. So it's just like another almost more noisy variation of the moss, just kind of give it some surface breakup on top of what we already have. So here I'm just going through with a black and white spots, and I'm just messing with the slope blur grayscales, and I'm slope blurring them twice and then blending between each other with some masks. So, and then it gives us this nice black and white kind of result here, and this is just going to be overlaid on top of our actual cliff. Now, before we actually add this guy on here, I'm actually going to do some subtracting of the crevices, and I'm just doing a shadows and an invert on this guy. Now, what this is going to do is the shadows and inverting is going to give us a mask of where the crevices are in the cliff. Basically, what I wanted to happen was I didn't want this finer moss to be hidden in those crevices. I just wanted to be on the most top peaks, so I made sure to subtract that from the actual mask that we had just gotten. And again, I'm using that moss mask because I only want this finer moss to show up around where that the original moss was. So I don't want it to be placed kind of randomly. I just want it to be almost in conjunction next to each other. So wherever you see the kind of the moss that has the, you can kind of see the leaves to it, this one's going to be almost right next to it. So kind of similar placement where the mask is and stuff like that. Here I'm just rotating light, making sure everything is looking good. And I'm just moving the outputs because I know I still have quite a bit of ways to go on the graph, so just going to continue forward. Next up, I want to add some pine leaves that actually lay on top of this moss. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually taking a gradient. I transformed it, so I rotated it, I believe 90. And then what I'm doing here is I'm doing a curve at the bottom and blending between the two. Now, as you can see, when we blend those two, you won't really see it until you actually add a histogram scan, because then we'll bring in the peaks of the whites and the blacks, and you can kind of see the silhouette it gives us. So it gives us almost like a half crescent like leaf shape, kind of like what we did with the moss. To get the full shape, I just moved it to the middle of the texture sheet, did a mirror so it mirrors on both sides, and then I did another transform to scale it in. I did a non-uniform so it gives us some sort of depth to it, so it's not completely flat. Did another warp so it's not completely straight up and down. And then here I'm just adding some sort of noise on the actual pine piece, so it gives us some striation, so it feels like it's almost like it's like a piece of pine that fell off the tree or something like that. Here I'm just doing 2 transforms to rotate him into place, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a height blend to stack them on top of each other so it looks like this kind of piece that you would see falling off a tree, you know, when 2 pieces of like those little pine needles are on top of each other. I just want to get some sort of variation like that. So once I have that, I'm actually going to do another directional warp, and with I believe it was a paraboloid. And what this does is it's just I'm gonna move this around until I get like, you can kind of see how it's doing a slight warp to it. It's similar to doing like a Perlin noise, but when you add just a basic paraboloid, you kind of get a little bit more control of where you're placing this movement. Once that's all set, I basically do the same thing with just a single pine needle. So before I did the height blend, and I do the same kind of thing with the directional warp to get 2 different variations. So what this is doing is that it's giving me 2 variations to plug in, similar to what we did with the moss. We wanted 2 different clumps. Well, with this guy, I wanted 2 different pine needles variations. Now, instead of using a tile sampler like we have been in the past, I'm actually going to use a shape splatter. What the shape splatter does is that it gives us the ability, this node is really good to overlay things, so it kind of conforms to the height that's already there. So instead of laying it out flat and just having the white peaks just being flat, it's almost conforming to the shapes, so it's gonna lay nice and evenly across the surface. So here again, this is one of those, I know I've said it quite a few times, but this is one of those nodes where you can kind of, there's a bunch of different parameters that you can play with and get some different results. The amount of pine needles, the rotation of them. It's similar to what you get in a tile sampler, but it just, the way it's being overlaid on top of the material is just a little bit better. So I love using the shape splatter when I know I'm going to overlay something on top of a material, but I also want it to like tile a bunch of places. So this is a perfect example. So I'm taking a pine needle that I want it to conform to the shape of what's already there, but I want to just splatter it all over the current material. So the last thing that I'd like to add to this material before we continue on to our albedo is 4-leaf clover. So I thought the moss and the pines were cool. I just wanted to give it, I wanted to give the moss a little bit more just breakup. So just having this little detail helped a lot to break up the moss. So there's some instances where you can kind of see clovers randomly. So this is the area where I'm actually just going ahead and create that. And again, it's just a couple polygons, a shape, blending in between each other, doing a subtle blur, some histograms, some transforms. And then here I'm actually mirroring that transform. So that slight rotation with the mirror now gives us almost that heart looking shape. I want to give it some depth with some non-uniform blur. And I'm also having another kind of depth area with the gradient. So the gradient makes it so that the edges of the clover flare out where the inner part is kind of just indented inwards. After that, I want to add some veins onto this guy like you would on any sort of leaf. So I just go ahead and do a cells, an edge detect, a blur high quality grayscale, and then just blend that into itself. And same thing here with a stem. I want to have a stem on the clover, so I'm just doing a basic shape, just a really thin straight up and down rectangle, do a non-uniform blur grayscale to give it some sort of depth, and I'm just going to blend that onto the shape that we already have. Continuing on to the same kind of treatment that we were doing with the veins, I wanted to give it some sort of directional veins, or almost directional horizontal lines that you would on like leaves and stuff. So went ahead with the tile sampler, did an edge detect, did a safe transform grayscale. With the safe transform grayscale, you can rotate things on a 45 while keeping the tiling consistent. So if you were to try to rotate this with a regular transform, it's going to actually break the tiling. So make sure to look into the safe transform if you're having trouble with that. Just did a quick blur, directional warp, and then I'm just blending it on top of the clover. I made sure to grab a mask prior to the shape that we were getting, just so that this new directional veins just applies to the clover. And similar to what we did with to get the actual cliff shape with the splatter circular, I just plugged in that clover shape, but instead of going crazy with the different parameters like we did with the cliff, this one's a little bit more simple. We just wanted to rotate 3 times, so this is just me messing with some of these parameters to get a nice clover shape. Messing with the radius so they're kind of closer together. It's looking good. And lastly, I just want to do a subtle warp to it, so brings some organic feel to it. So all the edges aren't just perfectly straight and it's not a perfect shape that we start multiplying everywhere. So once we have this guy, I'm gonna do the same treatment that we did with the moss, the original moss, where we have all these different inputs. Again, I just created a thorn and I'm grabbing an invert grayscale. I'm doing a transform similar to what we did with the dot node. The transform is just merely there to keep the connections nice and clean. I'm doing a normal with a value of 3 and keep it on DirectX. And then I'm doing a transform and scaling that thorn up, and then just warping it slightly with the Perlin noise. This one is actually just to get the mask of where these clovers are kind of appearing. So last time when we did the moss, we did like a half sphere because we wanted that half sphere looking shape for our moss clumps. This one, we want the clovers to be in the center, but kind of fading out outwards on our texture sheet. So that's why I scaled up the sphere a little bit, or sorry, the thorn, and then just gave it some undulation to break it up a little bit. So now once we have those guys plugged into the appropriate slots, this is me going through the different parameters and just finding something that I'm liking. So basically what I'm looking for is a nice clump of clovers that will be able to do that same treatment we did with the pine cones, where we're just going to do a shape splatter and just overlay them on top of our moss. So again, here throughout the entire graph, I'm just keeping consistent with naming things and keeping stuff nice and organized. It makes it a lot easier once we're, going through our albedo, going through our roughness, just to find connections and know where things are happening. So on that shape splatter, I actually went back again and to grab that moss mask that we were talking about. Again, because I know the clovers, I wanted them to be on top of the moss. I just went ahead and grabbed that moss mask. So it's super important. That one I keep going back to because I know that's where stuff is going to be placed. And it's a good input to have because in the shape splatter there is a mask map threshold, and it tells the shape splatter only splatter this shape on the areas where the mask map has its influence on. So again, here I'm just messing with the same parameters. Again, you can kind of mess with these to your liking, or feel free to just plug in the same values that I'm plugging in here. So here I'm just adding some frames, again keeping everything nice and neat on our graph. I'm a big believer in just keeping your graph nice and organized. I hate seeing spaghetti nodes all over the place because it makes it harder whenever all those connections are going all over the place to find where stuff are plugged in, and just overall makes it less presentable. So here we're actually going to start our phase of creating the color map for this guy, our albedo. So the first thing I like to do is we're gonna take the final height map and we're gonna blend it into itself, but with a ambient occlusion. So you saw me there just plug in the final height into an ambient occlusion, and I'm overlaying the final height onto that ambient occlusion. This gives us a little bit more noise, and it helps the gradient map just have a little bit more information to read. I added a fractal sum in there and blended it again on top of itself, and then I started bringing in a gradient. Now the colors that I'm sampling are off screen, off our completed graph, so feel free to sample any sort of colors off CG textures or wherever you guys like. That's always one of my favorite things to do, is just grab some photo reference and just grab the color picker from the gradient and just kind of sample some colors from it. Now, one thing about this guy is I'm going to use the get slope. Feel free to download it off the Substance Share. What this guy does is it gives you a nice mask for like the peaks and the valleys on your material based on the height. So what I'm doing here is I'm grabbing the height before I added all the kind of micro noise and all that stuff. So you'll notice that I didn't grab the final height to plug into this guy. I went back quite a bit to find the height before we added the final like moisture noise and stuff like that. It just gives it a little bit it gives the get slope a little bit better information to read because it's mostly focusing on larger shapes rather than micro detail. It gets a little bit too noisy. The get slope is really cool because it reminds me of one of the matte caps in ZBrush that gave me the peaks and the valleys. So it gives you kind of that similar effect. And what I did with that get slope was I used it to create a mask to blend two different gradient colors into itself. So I had a light kind of brown and a dark brown, and those were just created from HSLs that we got from our original color block-in. Again, moving forward, getting some more color variation, and here I'm just getting some basic grunge maps with some directional warps to just break up the surface of the color, get some different colors in there. And the directional warp is actually the intensity is actually coming from, we created another ambient occlusion. I'm just using that as the intensity for the grunge, so it just warps a little bit. You can kind of see once I start bringing up the intensity, the kind of result it gives us there. And this is just to bring in some whites in here. So again, I like just bringing in a levels or an HSL and just slightly shifting the color that we have. I feel like it's a lot easier than just going in and creating another gradient, color picking some stuff, especially if you're just doing like solid colors or just like similar colors. It's a lot quicker to get those nodes. Now next up, I'm gonna add some dirt to this guy. And previous videos that you might have seen, I love using the dirt node inside of Substance Designer, and it's a great way to create a mask to get some dirt onto your materials. All you really need is a curvature smooth, your normal plugged in, and an ambient occlusion. So that's what you see me plug in here. And I'm just messing with the different parameters to give me a mask of where I want this dirt to be placed on the material. This mask is going to be plugged into the opacity of a blend node. And what I did for this guy, I literally just chose a solid uniform color. So like a brown, for instance, here I just did a straight up brown. I didn't use any sort of gradient or anything, and I felt like that worked for what I was trying to get there. So kind of like how I described getting the HSL and levels to get some different colors. Here you see me take the original brown, and I'm just literally messing with the hue shift to get a green. Now what this is gonna be used for is for our moss. Again, we're just getting some colors here. I just felt it was a lot easier than to sample like a texture and start a new gradient and get some different colors. For me, this is a lot quicker just to change the hue of some gradient that you have going on. It gives me a pretty good result. But feel free, if you want to, you can create a gradient, whatever you guys like. And this is where we went back to find the lichen mask, and that's getting plugged into our opacity of that blend node. So that's how we get that nice greenery starting to show up onto our material. Next up, this is where we're actually going to get the moss color added on this guy. So here I'm actually going back to, again, that famous moss mask. I'm always going back to it because I know that's where our moss is being placed. So here you just see me plug that guy in. Again, just sampling off screen the colors from our finished graph just to get something similar. And I'm going to blend between these guys with just another grunge. Feel free to use any sort of grunge you want. I just felt like this is what I needed. I wanted the moss to have some sort of variation in the hues, so it just wasn't overall a same green color. I wanted to have some sort of differentiation in the greens. So that's why I have like a lighter and a darker green, and then just used a grunge to blend between the two. And once I plug this guy in, you can kind of see now we're starting to get the moss showing up on the cliff. So, you know, starting to give us some nice color on our brown cliff that we got going on. And here, again, I'm doing that same trick, just doing an HSL to change the hue because I'm looking for a new color for the finer moss. Again, I just went back like how we did where we found the moss mask. I just went in and find the finer moss mask that we added and plugged that into our opacity of the blend. Same thing. This one I actually did start a new gradient. I went back to where we actually added the pine needles, and I'm plugging that guy into a new gradient, and I'm sampling off screen a texture of some pine needles that I found. You'll notice that the gradient might look a little weird, a little noisy, but it's okay because we're literally just taking that and blending it with the mask that we're getting it from our shape splatter. So the bottom connection point of the shape splatter creates a nice mask that we could plug in a flood fill and create a grayscale mask for it. So that's how we're creating our black and white mask here. Continuing forward, this time I same thing, bringing in an HSL to change the hue color, and this is going to be used for our clovers. I'm going to go back into our shape splatter, do the same kind of treatment to get that mask that I was talking to you about. So you see me here duplicating that flood fill to grayscale, and here I'm just plugging it into the opacity of this blend. Now you can kind of see the clovers are starting to pop in a little bit. They're a little, because they're like a darker green as opposed to the lighter green of the moss. You can kind of see them a little bit better. Now earlier on we added the dirt only to the cliff, but now that we've added all this new stuff, I just want to add a final dirt overlay on top of our whole material. So the dirt also affects the moss. So it just gives us a little bit more definition to the shapes and all the different stuff that we added. So the clovers, the pine needles, and all that stuff. And talking about giving a little bit more definition, this is our final kind of tweak that we do to the albedo. Is we're going to add a curvature smooth. So this acts almost like a cavity map. It gives us a nice highlights and crevices onto our albedo. So you see me bringing in a curvature smooth, and then once that's being blended on with an add sub, I do a curvature sobble, again with an add sub at a low opacity, and just plug that guy into our final output. And that pretty much sums up the final albedo. Here I'm just going ahead and moving some stuff around because I know I'm going to start working on the roughness. I just want to keep stuff nice and organized. And this is what I talked about, how those like spaghetti strands just going across a bunch of different nodes, it makes it's an eyesore for me, and it's a little hard to see. So just want to head and move those because I know this is the next part I'm going to be working on. So I want to start on the roughness, and to start I'm going to take our final albedo and I'm just going to run a grayscale conversion through it. Once we have that, it's going to give us a nice grayscale, but the values are going to be a little bit too extreme, so we're getting a lot of darks, which is going to make the material feel almost like if it's wet or something. So I bring in the levels and start getting it closer to some grayscale values. And once we have that, I'm actually going to duplicate that the get slope, and again use that to my advantage to get some nice peaks and valleys from our earlier height map. So you can kind of see that we're getting just the larger edges on this guy. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to blend this guy on top of that newly leveled grayscale map. So you can kind of see, we bring down the opacity. We can kind of see now we can almost control where the highlights are going to be. So there I have the highlights. The darker areas are just on the edges of the cliff. So that's why I just overlaid that guy. And next up, this next kind of portion is pretty much similar to how we were treating the albedo, where we basically took a uniform color, or in this case, it was a gradient for the albedo, but because we're working with grayscale value on the roughness, I'm just taking this uniform node that's just a solid black. And what we're doing is we're gonna basically go and find all the masks that we are using to tell the color, okay, this is where this specific color goes. We're going to take those connections and tell the roughness, okay, this is where this specific color is going to go onto our roughness map. So pretty easy. I'm just going to go through the same steps. So I'm going to go from the moss to the finer moss to the pine needles and to the clovers. Again, you can kind of see me going through it. I'm just literally grabbing the same mass, and this is just easy. It's almost like streamlined this way because we're using the same mass, and because we were doing it in the same way that it was layered on the material, you just go from a left to a right. So here just doing the pine needles again, just going ahead finding where that mask was, and I chose a uniform color of white here, and then I'm just messing with the opacity, so feel free to mess with any of these values to see how they fit your needs. I wanted the pine needles to feel a little bit more rough, not as smooth. And finally, the clover's coming in. So that's like one of the last masks that we're using here. And lastly, these are like the final tweaks that I just go in and do. I'm just moving stuff into place, naming stuff accordingly, looking at our final graph. I noticed that the curvature sobble was set to DirectX, so I went ahead and fixed that. And I thought it was a little bit too intense. So always zooming in on your final 2D image is a great way to see of any discrepancies that you might not have seen earlier. So here I'm just rotating on a 3D sphere, kind of give you an idea of what it's going to look like in the final renders. So that about covers it. Hope you guys learned something. In the next video, we're actually going to take that material and we're going to bring it into Unreal to do some fun vertex painting. See you guys in the next one.